This is a question just generally to the panel. Last year, the Australia 21 report canvassed a number of different options for drug law reform in Australia. What is the position of your party in relation to the proposals in that report?
Well, look, Marion was a part of that Australia 21 report, which was a tragedy that report wasn't given more credence by the major political parties. Julia Gillard discounted it. The report you referred to was had eminent Australians on it, including Bob Carr, the current Foreign Minister, ironically before he became Foreign Minister. It has Mick Palmer, who is an ex-commissioner of the Federal Police. It has an ex-health, Liberal health minister. So it really was an eminent report, and never has a report by such eminent people been resoundingly ignored by government. It was really a catalyst to the formation of the party that this report could be ignored. It was a proof that the major parties won't address the issue of drug law reform in any real sense. That's where Drug Law Reform Australia hopes to set in and put these issues to the public. Marion, do you want to comment on Australia 21?
Well, I think the Australia 21, was the second report where they were looking at different models that had been successful overseas, I guess. And one model, I think, that was put forward by Emeritus Professor David Pennington was to do with how we could decriminalise marijuana. But I guess what I'd like to say about this is that this is what we want to happen. We want the debate, we want open conversation on what alternatives are possible, so that we could look at what David Pennington put out there on how we could, what model we could have for cannabis in, I'm not sure now if he said decriminalising or legal, I think he said legalising, but with restrictions, etc. But this is what we need to happen. We need people to start talking about what alternatives there are and how they might work, and you might come up with one way of doing it and realise, no, that's not going to work because of this, and come up with another one. So it's getting this discussion out in the open to work out what the best alternatives for our country would be, looking at research and evidence from overseas countries and within our own communities. I mean, New Zealand has just come up with, there's a bill in their parliament at the moment looking at synthetic drugs, rather than just blatantly prohibiting every new synthetic drug that comes on the market. They're now looking at alternative ways of handling that. So lots of countries are doing things, and we need to start doing that as well.
Thanks, Marion. Yeah, that sums up the position there. Ultimately, we are involved in starting the discussion, looking at these models of regulating these drugs and looking at alternatives from the current criminalisation of drug use.
What would you say to those commentators that argue that decriminalising drugs will just cause drug use to increase and therefore the social cost to Australians increase?
The question of whether or not the regulation of marijuana will increase the consumption depends on how that regulation is implemented. For argument's sake, if we advertised cannabis like tobacco was advertised for 40 years, yes, surely consumption will increase. But if it's done with common sense policy, sold in perhaps plain packaging, perhaps through pharmacies, those people that decide to consume it would not be criminalised, but there's no real evidence to suggest that the actual consumption of the marijuana itself will increase. Personally, we would admit the dangers of marijuana, if not addiction. You've certainly got apathy, and perhaps the danger to young developing teenagers is important as well. So again, the regulation would help control these substances. If marijuana is legalised, ironically, it would be harder for a teenager to buy marijuana through a legalised outlet, as it is hard for a teenager to buy alcohol. The reason is it's regulated. So a regulated market has many benefits. Any thoughts, Greg, as a law enforcement?
Well,
yes, sorry, I just have a quick comment. I think where there has been decriminalisation of drugs, that drug use has actually fallen. If you look at Portugal, for example, they decriminalised all drugs there, and crime and drug use has actually fallen, and they purely treat it as a health issue. If you look, for example, in South Australia here, they decriminalised marijuana use over 20 years ago, and there was no significant increase in marijuana use. So I think there are some good models throughout the world where there has been decriminalisation of drug use, and it certainly hasn't created a situation that a lot of commentators say will happen when you decriminalise drug use. People will always say, well, look at alcohol, you know, that's what will happen with other drugs if we decriminalise them because it'll be the same as alcohol, but we know that's not the case. And actually, I think there's a good argument to look at ways in which we can rein in the alcohol industry and look at ways in which we can deal with some of the obvious harms that come from alcohol use. So I think to decriminalise drug use certainly would address a lot of the harms that we see from drug use. And I also think too that we have to acknowledge that, you know, with every drug there's a risk. You know, it doesn't matter what sort of drug it is, there is a risk, and it's about managing those risks without saying that one is necessarily any worse than the other. So I think that that's what we have to focus on the risk rather than the drug itself.
In relation to making decriminalised drugs, I mean, if the government's controlling drugs, then surely it would get down to a price issue. So organised crime at the moment supplying drugs, so we still do it a lot cheaper than what the government can supply drugs, or we go to pharmacy and so on. So how do we resolve that anyway?
Well, the price of drugs in the illicit drug market aren't steady. You know, if you, for example, see what happens when there's a major bust by police, the price immediately goes up. So that then we have a lot of people committing crime, for example, to get heroin because there's been a drug bust. The price goes up and the purity goes down. So those fluctuations in the price and purity of drugs causes significant harm to the community. So if we had a regulated, controlled pricing system, and of course made sure that the right people were getting, you know, the drug, then we would have a much more stable environment. You can use heroin as a pharmaceutical grade dose for all of your life, provided that you get good health checkups. In fact, it's probably less harmful for you if you've got a regulated, medicated dose than a lot of other toxic drugs. So, you know, we recognise there are risks, but also too, we also recognise that there are things that we can do to address those risks.
On the economics of that question, basically the criminal enterprises put anything up to 1,000% markup on across the board. So, you know, the propensity for the government to even put 100% tax on would still make the legal supply of drugs many times cheaper than that supplied by the black market. And the benefit, of course, is that this money that the government taxed would go back into health services.
Rather than to the pockets of criminals who do lots and lots of other criminal things with the money that they make from the drug trade.
We already have 2 drugs that are legal and cause lots of problems. That's alcohol, tobacco. And now you want to introduce the illegal drugs into this scenario.
Well, interesting question. I'd argue there that perhaps we're not really introducing a third drug. We are certainly introducing a third legal drug into a market. As I said there's over almost 500,000 Australians use marijuana in the last week and 2 million have used it in the last year. So there's no thought about the drug being introduced. We're just saying the use exists, it's popular, and it should be regulated and taxed and controlled by the government rather than criminal enterprises. And the other interesting part on this is, if those economists amongst us, is that these are basically substitute drugs, substitute products, I should say, that if somebody is disposed to getting intoxicated on a Friday night, and perhaps in the current environments has a skinful of booze, may well, in a legalised an environment where marijuana is legalised, smoke a joint of marijuana instead. The difference in the effect and the social cost of the two drugs couldn't be further apart. People on marijuana do not become violent. They do not become a danger to themselves and lose coordination. So again, if there was a movement away from the use of alcohol to marijuana, I'm not sure that would be a bad thing in terms of social cost or cost to the individual.
And there are lots of other legal drugs as well. If you're feeling unwell, you can go into a pharmacy and get any type of drug. I know there are more medications, but certainly, when you look at what's available, we always talk about alcohol and tobacco, but there are lots and lots of other drugs which are regulated, controlled, and available for all sorts of purposes. So we know that again has some risks, but as I said earlier, there are some risks, with any type of drug use. But we certainly have lots and lots of drugs available through pharmacies and places such as that, and I think that's probably a good way of looking at a model for distribution of substances that are currently illicit.
Could I just add something to that? From the point of view of Families and Friends for Drug Law Reform, we produced a U-curve where we had on this side of the top of the U-curve legalisation, up here prohibition, and they're both bad policies. And down at the bottom of the U-curve we have a minimisation of harms, or reduction of the least possible harms. So with both legalisation and prohibition, we are trying to come down here, so that we're trying to make less harms with prohibition, less harms with legalisation of drugs. We have a lot of harms under alcohol, with the total legalisation and the huge amounts of money in that from the alcohol industry, the advertising, everything. I mean, it's just become pretty bad use of alcohol, and prohibition of some drugs has caused the same. But if we can bring in policies that reduce the harm, like we have now with tobacco, the legal drug tobacco, I mean, it is coming down on that axis down to starting to get down to the bottom. Of course, if we do go too far with that and we decide to prohibit it, goodness knows what will happen. We'll probably go back up to the top of the other side of the curve. So we need to be careful. But the ideal is to get to the bottom of that U-curve with the harms.
I understand that you intend to run candidates in the upcoming federal election for the Senate. If you're successful in that venture, how do you propose to engage with the political system to pursue your political agenda for drug law reform?
Well, that's interesting. In the Australian Senate, it has a great committee system where an independent senator can make a fairly strong contribution to policy. We would certainly be raising the Senate's Estimates Committee to raise the drug issue and being proactive by introducing single members' bills, and certainly becoming a voice of reason in the Parliament on these issues. The other thing about a parliamentarian having a single-issued politician, it's important that we would not be disruptive in the Parliament, but would behave responsibly. We believe that a politician can vote according to his conscience, unlike the major parties that pursue a policy of strict party discipline, where anyone that votes against the decisions of the Labor Party in the floor of the Parliament gets expelled from the party. And of course, anyone that votes against the policy decisions of a small group in the Liberal Party will possibly lose pre-selection and have their career cut short. We believe that politicians in general should argue honestly and on the facts, rather than perhaps on the basis of their party affiliations. And funnily enough, this is the one country in the world where the discipline of the two-party system is almost total. America, UK, all of Europe, politicians are essentially voted in Parliament to represent their electorate and make a decision on the facts. Not so in Australia, and to be perfectly frank, this makes me pretty angry, because it does mean that we've got politicians in Parliament voting completely contrary to their own opinion, and only in the very rare occasion where they get a conscience vote on a particular issue do they actually get their chance to vote as an honest human being. So our party, again, we believe in that, in terms of that philosophy, we have something to offer the Australian Parliament, and this goes to the very nature of what we're talking about, of independent candidates in the Parliament, smaller parties, smaller groupings with interests that are traditionally ignored by the major parties, having a say in Parliament. The Senate system, because it has a system of proportional representation, allows these smaller ideas to be elected, and things like Nick Xenophon, for argument's sake, in the House of Representatives. All of those independents, I think, have done a first-class job in the Parliament, and that is again outside the current two-party system.
We have a large number of lobby industries that want to keep the current system as it is. We have police and law enforcement on the one hand, and on the other hand we have the illegal drug industry, the criminals that want to keep the illegal industry as it is.
It's a very interesting point you raise there, and that's one of the great impediments to change is the vested interests of particular groups and lobby groups. Even the health industry now is beholden to the government for handouts, and the health industry does a magnificent job in this country in terms of frontline support of those with drug addictions, but these organisations get their money on a piecemeal fashion from the government, so they're beholden. You've got the police force certainly has an interest in more money being spent for them to pursue the legitimate tasks. So there. The prison system is another one that benefits. The prison complex, which is now done by private companies, they have a massive interest and no doubt are lobbying governments to increase the number of people and the laws for drugs, because it feeds their bottom line. These are corporations. So look, the change will happen slowly, but again, as a movement that believes these drug laws are unjust, we need to make representations, and again, that's the sole reason that I believe personally a political party can do this, where other traditional groupings in the society cannot. Politics is where decisions are made for the greatest good for the greatest number, and I'm quite happy to put this to the Australian public, believing that the Australian public is more open to reasoned argument and fact-based decisions if they're given a chance. And that's what we want to do as a party, is put the drug law reform issue directly to the public and sidestep these vested interests that do have an interest in maintaining a status quo.
Can I just answer that too, that in a moment of inspiration recently, I went through all of the different groups that benefit from the drug law. And I first of all thought of police because, as you point out, a lot of resources go towards the police, and that means more police dogs, more police powers, more police guns and other types of equipment. There's more prosecutors, there's more prisons, and also too the media, the press feed on the drug war. There's a whole industry that's been built around the war on drugs. But what I think we should be doing is I guess, pricking the conscience of those people that know that this system isn't working. And there are lots of people out there, lots of police out there, who know that this system is failing, but don't have either the capacity or the opportunity to speak up. And I think that this movement now will fill that void.
I understand that you intend to run candidates in the upcoming federal election for the Senate. If you're successful in that venture, how do you propose to engage with the political system to pursue your political agenda for drug law reform?
All of our candidates at this stage, that's an interesting question, and I guess you're asking is why should the Australian public trust a single issue party that could, in one or two scenarios, have the balance of power and use that power to their own ends? The answer is basically that our politicians will sign a pledge that they will support the government of the day on all money bills. This has been done before with the Australian Democrats, and to me it makes common sense. We're not destructive or in the business of making or breaking governments. We're in the business of making a positive contribution to the Parliament of the country.
Okay.
Well, if that finishes questions, I'd like to thank you all for coming today and appreciate it. And you'll see us soon at the ballot box.